Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Ellen Fanning. Coming up, the energy regulator warns that Australia's renewable energy transformation isn't happening fast enough to meet climate targets. Inside the PM's media strategy, getting cosy with shock jocks to win younger voters. And we'll look at a new way of providing dementia care aimed at empowering people living with the disease. Joining me on the panel, infectious diseases expert Kudzai Kanhutu. Thank you for joining us up in Sydney for the day.
Yeah, thank you, Ellen.
Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program, Polly Hemming, is with us. Hi, Polly.
Hi, thanks, Ellen.
In Canberra, where it's freezing. All the heaters are on, gas and otherwise. Journalist at the Daily Oz, Tom Crowley. What, -8 this morning, was it?
Oh, it was horrible. Horrible.
That's refusing to get out of bed, I reckon. No governing. And in Adelaide, where the sun always shines, Chief Advocate for National Seniors Australia, Ian Henschke. G'day, Ian.
Hello, everyone.
Always good to see you. And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag #TheDrum, and we're on Facebook. Researchers say all 5 million Australian households currently using gas will need to wean themselves off the fossil fuel if Australia has any hope of achieving net zero by 2050. The Grattan Institute says it includes everything from home heaters to gas stovetops. The International Director of the Smart Energy Council, Richie Merzian, says state and territory governments have a key role in supporting households to make that energy transition.
The demand for gas right now is a problem. I mean, if we're going to go to net zero, then basically we need to get off fossil fuels completely. Whether it's a small portion of our economy or whether it represents a much larger share like in our current electricity grid. And every home has the means with which to do that right now. There are alternatives that exist. And with federal governments and state governments all committing to the same target, really what we should be seeing are a number of policies and means with which to implement all the work that's necessary to get us off fossil fuels and onto a fully electric future. I'm based in Canberra. It was -3 degrees this morning. I get the need to have a toasty home, but the reality is we can do that with electric appliances. Now, some people will have to wait until their gas appliances die. Some people will need to save up because those electric appliances are more expensive. And sometimes there's impediments like having to pay fees to get yourself off the gas network as well. Governments can provide interest-free loans, or they can help cover the gap between the price of an electric appliance and its gas equivalent. There are ways that governments can smooth this transition, particularly for those who need that help. And in some states it's happening, in others it's not. And this is where we can harmonise, this is what we can accelerate, and we need to do it if we want to meet our target. The risks right now in terms of having those gas cookers and heaters really are in the respiratory field. And the more at risk you are, whether you're young or whether you're old or whether you have an existing respiratory illness, then it exacerbates that as well.
Kudzai, let's start with you. You're from Victoria. Victorians love cooking with gas and heating with gas. How big of a challenge would it be to get off gas?
I think what you've walked through there is that spectrum and that scale of what does transition look like in different contexts. So there's the sort of individual household, how do you manage bills, can you afford it? If you're renting, who's responsible for actually mapping that transition for you and how soon? But I think the challenge for us in healthcare is that at the moment, a lot of our performance metrics are baked around the patient-facing aspect. Are we seeing patients in a timely fashion?
And this is in terms of transition?
Transition, yeah.
Energy transition for the health sector, because you're big energy users in hospitals.
Big energy users. And who then owns that responsibility when we already have challenges around who funds what within the healthcare system, who then takes that responsibility to map out what is our carbon footprint. So I think we make up about 7% of the national carbon footprint, but at the moment there isn't that process and that methodology in place to actually help organisations, large hospitals, large institutions to plan what is our transition, what does it look like, how do we pay for it, and who's actually ultimately responsible for charting that change. So some real kind of challenges I see for the healthcare sector around how to respond and where those targets are. And people are trying. So for example, in the surgical field, they're trying to find ways to use, anaesthetic gases more efficiently because they can actually be really carbon intensive to produce. So there are pockets, but it's not consistently applied and nobody really seems to be owning it at that organisational level.
I think, Polly, if you walked out on the street and said, right, we've got to stop using gas, this would be an enormous surprise to people. I mean, I know people who are getting the gas line extended in their suburban street for their new home so that they can have gas, so they can be cooking with gas. And the suggestion that that's really not a very future-proof thing to do for a new house is met with a blank stare.
Yeah, well, interestingly, AEMO, in its latest gas statement of opportunities, actually said that gas is declining. And from 2024, we'll be using less gas than ever. And through to 2030, I think gas use will be dropped by a third. So anecdotally, it might seem like it's all systems go with gas, but there is a natural attrition happening.
And is that just the cost of it has gone off? Is that what's contributing to it more than anything?
I think it is being replaced by renewables.
Right.
At a domestic level, you really got to look at what sector, like where is the gas coming from? So yes, we produce a lot of gas in Australia and use a lot of gas in Australia, but households are only responsible for about 3% of the gas produced in Australia. The biggest users of the gas that we produce is the gas industry to produce gas for export. So if you wanted to ramp down or phase out gas altogether, a really low-hanging fruit would actually be to tackle that biggest producer and user. How it's an imperative that we get gas out of households and out of.
But we're not going to stop
industries using
exporting gas in Australia. It's a huge industry.
It's a huge industry. It doesn't bring much to the Australian economy, though. If anything, it costs the Australian economy. You're right, it's an absolutely huge industry. It's not a big employer, though. It doesn't pay much tax, doesn't pay much in royalties, and the profits go offshore. So I don't know why we're not going to get rid of the gas industry in Australia. It doesn't contribute that much.
Yeah. Everyone we've spoken to, Tom, in terms of the contribution that is made by households, says things like, as Polly does, it's not a lot, the contribution of gas inside households, but unless households do their bit, we can't get to our targets by 2030 and then by 2050.
Yeah, well, absolutely, and that I guess just shows how difficult the net zero challenge is, and that's what I find so interesting is, I think obviously the kind of Grattan report that's been discussed today and in the last couple of days about transitioning away from gas, just every little nook and cranny of this transition, you see sort of under every rock is a really significant challenge that we've really only begun thinking about. So that's only, if that is only 3% of the gas in Australia, just looking at what a thorny problem it is to get households off gas, and then you look at agriculture, you look at aviation, you look at cement production, we talk a lot about energy transmission and electricity generation in general. There are so many different corners of Australian life and the Australian economy that are going to have to undergo a really significant change in a really rapid period of time. So I think it's actually kind of all the more interesting how difficult the household gas challenge is, given that it represents such a small part of the overall picture.
I'm really stunned, Ian, by how much solar there is in Australia. Every time you look at the household rooftop solar, right, that ordinary Australians are putting on their roofs, it's just extraordinary. By 2050, says AEMO, which is the market regulator effectively, or market operator, by 2050, 2/3 of Australian homes will have solar. And of course, coming down the pike next year, we've got that budget promise from the last budget that's going to provide some sort of low-cost loans for low-income houses to sort of start to make that transition. It's an extraordinarily rapid transition that's being made.
Yes, indeed, and seniors are the ones that are doing a lot of that, because when you put solar panels on the roof of your house, it improves your house and helps you with your retirement income. And we've actually done a survey at National Seniors, and we found that about 90% of seniors believe that climate change is real, and more than 2/3 of them have bought either solar panels or solar hot water or batteries or an electric car or some way of trying to do something. And what we've said to government...
Can I just ask you a question, because you're taking me back to last century in terms of the belief thing. You could equally ask them if they believe the tooth fairy is real. Why is asking them about whether they think climate change is real relevant?
Well, because there was a lot of shock jocks and late night TV on another network saying that it was all rubbish. So if you want to actually have a look at what people think, you ask them what they think, and that's what they're telling us. And what they say they want to do is invest in green bonds or energy bonds. The UK has issued them for ordinary people. They get 4.2%. and people can just walk into the National Bank in Britain and buy them. And we told Jim Chalmers before the last budget that he should do it here. He's doing it for retail investors, but he's not doing it for individuals. And we'd like to see it through the Australia Post, for example. You could go down and buy a green bond. In Britain, you can buy up to £100,000 of green bonds. And if we want this to happen quickly, I want Mr Chalmers to listen to what we're saying.
And what would you do with the money that you raised through the bond?
Well, you'd do what they want to do, which is transition to a zero emissions future. You would get there a decade ahead of time if you had everybody invested in it, because when you go and buy a green bond or a clean energy bond, it's your commitment, and then you want to see the economy change. This transition is not going to happen without investment. Once you've got the money, you can invest in those things we're talking about. You can have community batteries, for example, which was one of the Labor Party's policies in the run-up to the last election. So you could have people without gas and having induction tops and electric cars and all of that. They need all that. But to do that, you actually have to have the infrastructure built. And so that's why we're saying the federal government should listen to what National Seniors is saying, and we're saying give people, ordinary Australians, the opportunity to take the money and put it into a green bond, a green energy bond.
Well, it's worth taking a step back here, looking at our total emissions nationally. OK, this is the task, and how much households actually contribute to that picture. Have a look at this pie chart at the part that says stationary energy there, bottom right. If we break it down, household energy use makes up a decent chunk of that. There you go. Let's look at that national picture again. Okay, and the Australian Energy Market Operator, AEMO, has declared we are not doing enough to lower the emissions generated by these sectors, particularly electricity. So that's what they've come out with today. We've got to get, Polly, from here, where we have big coal-fired power stations with transmission lines going into the cities on the east coast and on the west coast. And then we need to somehow transition that, stitch together a system that's infinitely more complicated, right? We need a vast number of little generators and we need storage and firming to fill the gaps in the renewable. And then we've got to get all these solar panels, 3.5 million solar panels on people's roofs so they don't short the whole system, basically. And we have to do it while we're running both systems at once. And this guy it's keeping him up at nights. He says, we're not getting there fast enough.
Yeah, no, we're not getting there fast enough, and we're not seeing the investment that we need. And the reason for that is because what's the return on investment? You know, it's a really nice idea to say that I want to go down to the post office and buy a green bond, but again, I'm going to sort of take it bigger and say there's not the investment happening that is needed in those large-scale renewable projects. And that is because, despite the fact that the government said we're going to have 82% renewables in our electricity grid by 2030, there's no policy sort of levers that would provide a return on investment. So if the government goes on Dragon's Den and they said we're going to have 82% renewables in the grid by 2030, Deborah Meaden is going to say, great, how are you going to get there?
Okay, and I'm going to be one of the dragons on the other end. No, I'm going to invest in this, I'm going to say, because, okay, 1/3 of the coal-fired capacity in the national electricity market, which admittedly isn't Perth, but it's everywhere else, is going to be shut down by 2030, okay? Either because it wore out and died and fell apart and screws and things and literally they fall apart, or because it's not economic to do it. That is the prediction. Now, the market operators come out today and said, forget that. Within 6.5 years, 2/3 of those coal-fired power generators
absolutely.
will be off. What more guarantee do you need? Stick the money in and you'll make money. Where else are we going to get electricity from?
Because, like, if it's your buck, okay, I'm Deborah and I'm going, well, the government might build more gas-fired power stations. Like, what's the guarantee to me that you are going to be making people buy renewable energy and that I'm going to get some sort of return on investment?
Because it's going to be cheaper. Renewable energy is cheaper than gas-fired power. It's cheaper than coal. I mean, seriously, do they want rose petals strewn on the ground in front of them?
If you're a business, you want to know, you want certainty in your investment. And we actually had a policy that did this. So we did have a legislated renewable energy target where the government said to these liable entities, guys, you have to buy renewable energy. And then there was a renewable energy investment boom because investors saw that they had customers. They knew people were going to be buying huge amounts of renewables. It's not enough to just say we're going to have 82% renewables in the grid and then not have to compel people to buy them or de-risk that landscape. At the moment...
But isn't that just where the world's heading? Let me ask you, Tom. I mean, OK, so what this bloke from AEMO, the market operator who stays up at night keeping the lights on, right? He's sitting there going, OK, so we're here with the coal-fired routine and we've got to get to there. And we've got all these proposals. Let's call them gunners, shall we, Tom? We're going to do this and we're going to do that. We've got a heap of gunners, but nobody's pressing the button on them. Between January and March this year, none of these things got financed, got green lit on the finance, even though the proposals are all there and they're sitting there. I mean, is that really an issue for the government, or do they just need to get on with it?
Well, I mean, the government is, the new government, it is worth pointing out at this point, is doing, some things in terms of providing public funding through its, what they call the Rewiring the Nation Fund for energy system upgrades. And obviously you can't click your fingers and make these things happen, but, that is starting to shift. I'm not sure whether, it should have been expected that in January to March some of that would already be flowing through, and it wasn't. But, one thing that investors have talked about in the past is the lack of certainty when there wasn't a specific government policy setting that was encouraging that. And the other part of what the government's doing, which is an imperfect mechanism and a mechanism that's often criticised, but is the new safeguard mechanism. And what the government would say, and in the form that that's passed Parliament, with negotiation from the Greens, that does have a hard cap on emissions from the largest polluters that we're talking about here, including a lot of the electricity generators, that will over time force them to ratchet down their emissions. And so in that context, as you say, with the coal plants shutting and, with these big emitters being forced to emit less, there just sort of has to be, to fill our energy needs, there has to be, that kind of renewable starting to come in to pick up the other side of it, right?
Reduce their emissions.
Yeah,
But they do have to reduce their emissions overall, right? There is a hard cap that the Greens impose going through the Senate on the overall emissions under safeguard covered companies, which includes 200 and something of the largest emissions. And it's not, again, I say it's not a perfect mechanism, but that is the beginning of a policy structure that can be used to force a reduction in emissions through the electricity system.
Isn't that enough, Polly? Isn't it clear that this is where the future is going to be? If you've got capital to invest and you've got a modern nation with enormous energy needs, I mean, it doesn't take an enormous leap of courage, does it, to invest?
Well, apparently it does, because it's not happening. And going back to that safeguard, yes, Tom's right, there is an overall hard cap on emissions, but this is going to be really interesting to see how the government negotiates this, because facility by facility, they don't have to reduce their emissions. They can purchase carbon offsets instead, and carbon offsets are relatively cheap.
So in other words, I'm not going to reduce my emissions. I'm just going to buy a emission reduction from somebody else who's reduced their emissions, who sold it to me. So in other words, I want to lose weight, but I'm not going to. I'm going to buy weight loss from some skinny teenager.
Yeah,
but this was what the Greens put in, right? I mean, this was the the legal requirement on the climate change minister at that point to say, well, then we have to revisit the rules about these offsets if everyone's waiting for everyone else to lose the weight. The minister now has that legal obligation to step in. The teeth that the Greens had in the Senate, right?
Sort of.
And
Sorry.
Look, I just want to say one thing, and that is that late last century, I went to Costa Rica with the Four Corners crew, and there was a country there that had reached net zero in 1999. Costa Rica had done it. They've got a population of about 3 million. I mean, it is possible for us to do it. And instead of talking about mechanisms and all these other things, I think we've just got to get on with the job.
Ian, that's
I mean,
we've wasted,
a
ridiculous thing
we've wasted
to say.
20
Everybody
years.
always gets mad at me, Ian, because I have a go at you, but this is how we talk to each other, and we've known each other a long time. So we're not having an argument at home. Please don't write in. I just like antagonising Ian. I have very few, and there's no smoking and drinking anymore, Ian, so I've got to have some outlets in life.
Yeah.
That is ridiculous. The federal government is not going to build the transmission systems of the future by itself. It's not going to build the power generation systems. There have to be the mechanisms for private capital to get in there. And that's what we're having the debate about.
Oh, let the market sort it out, Ellen. It's done a great job so far, hasn't it? And
Mr. Starlin, would you like Mr. Albanese to stand up tomorrow and say, OK, well, forget the submarines. We're going to build ourselves a renewable generation system in Australia instead. Is that it?
Well, look, if we're going to keep fiddling around like we've done for the last 20 years, which is what we've managed to do, which is actually turn it into an argument for 20 years, why don't we just go and visit Costa Rica and go and ask them how they did it? Why don't we go and ask a country that's done it?
Can I add something about energy?
Sure.
If that's all right. So it's really important to remember in Australia, electricity is just a minor part of the energy system. You showed that pie chart before. Fuel, transport is energy, stationary energy, fuels used on site, heating and cooling, that's energy. We're actually doing not too badly with electricity in Australia. You know, that there is household rollout, but more broadly, we're doing okay. That's actually the area that I'm least worried about. We have no policies in Australia. We've got a notional electric vehicle strategy that hasn't been implemented, but it's transport where emissions are going to be increasing. That is energy, stationary energy, manufacturing, industry, that is where emissions are ballooning. And that's what the safeguard mechanism is designed to address. And I still disagree that it has that kind of hard cap. But those are the areas that really need to be buying that's where renewables need to be happening, you know, electric vehicles, renewables for the electric vehicles industry and stuff. It's really important to not conflate energy just with electricity. Yeah.
I want to move. Yes, Tom.
Sorry.
You go.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, that's where I think it comes back to the point that you're making at the beginning there about kind of, you know, how difficult these conversations are going to be with people when it comes to switching away from gas stoves or switching away from, you know, petrol vehicles. Like, these are hard political conversations that need to begin, and that's where I thought, you know, Grattan's conversation, and your disclaimer, I did used to work at Grattan, but not on this subject. But I thought that their report this week looking at questions like, you know, can you try and incentivise or force landlords to replace the, you know, the kind of the gas hot water systems like I use, you know, in rental properties and in social housing. Like, you know, there are a lot of really significant questions in the weeds, and I think it is really important to start getting into the weeds a little bit.
Good comment. Have a look at this one, Kudzai. From electric vehicle batteries to rooftop solar to pharmaceuticals, the transition from clean energy is dependent on what are known as critical minerals. These include cobalt, lithium, manganese, as well as rare earth elements that are vital to powering things like mobile phones. Today, the federal government unveiled its critical minerals strategy, which aims to cement Australia as a superpower in the field over the next decade. The government's committed $500 million to grow the sector.
Our strategy highlights the role that our critical minerals will play in the world's net zero ambitions. This strategy will help to create diverse, resilient and sustainable supply chains. It will build our sovereign capability in critical minerals processing, and it will extract more value from our resources, resulting in more jobs and economic activity for our regions, and it will help deliver net zero by 2050.
And although the new strategy doesn't explicitly mention China, which produces more than 80% of the world's rare earth elements, the government says it will monitor foreign investment here in Australia to ensure none of it is counter to the national interest. So, Kuzo, that's an interesting point, isn't it? It's not just electric vehicles and solar panels that require these critical minerals. It's your sector as well in healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've ever been in an MRI machine, or if you've interacted with any diagnostic device in hospitals, a lot of the computing behind that requires the use of rare earth metals or minerals, and some of our key treatments or new prostheses, all of the new devices that we're plugging into people to help them stay up and walking and running are really reliant on these sorts of materials. Even though it's not explicit when you're in a hospital that that's what's in the engine room, it's really, especially as we digitise, it's really important in terms of semiconductors and conductors and all of the computing infrastructure that is becoming part and parcel of modern medicine. So really critically important in terms of us continuing to progress and advanced medicine.
And we've won the geological lottery in Australia over and over again, haven't we? We've got what the world needs. I'm reminded that when China cut off exports of rare earth elements to Japan in 2010 during a dispute, it threatened a lot of Japan's high-tech industries. So to what extent, whether again it's EVs or solar panels or medical devices, is this a national security issue?
Increasingly so. And it's also in the context of there's a lot of prospecting that's also happening behind the scenes and diplomacy around nations going, for example, to Africa and setting up camp there and starting to prospect in earnest, because there's a real realisation that part of the levers of, reducing sovereign risk is making sure that you have alternatives. And if you look at even rare earth metals, they're not actually geologically rare. It's just that, there are countries or areas that haven't been explored and people haven't had the infrastructure and the time yet to develop that and to embed that. So yes, we are lucky as a landmass that we have lots of places to look for it. But I'm increasingly concerned about what happens in regions where, for example, there's political instability and you have countries that are coming in, investing because they have the wherewithal, and developing what I would class as very extractive diplomatic relationships where you're stripping nations who don't necessarily have the means to actually make sure that the benefits flow on to communities. And I see that as being another sort of frontier that we need to also engage with in the interests of making sure that benefits flow and that countries, in a COVID context, for example, who have had things extracted from them, actually then have reaped the benefits of being able to put that resource back into community and to keep nations healthy and viable.
It's a huge pivot, isn't it, Tom, to go from the kind of bulk commodities. I'm not suggesting for a moment that iron ore won't continue to be a crucial commodity in the world, and coal in this country, to going to a whole heap of things that, I remember doing social studies, Tom, when I was your age, when I was younger than you, at school, and we had to learn what was coming out of Mount Isa, and we learned, and these ones, when you look at the names of these minerals, you've never heard of them, and we need cobalt and chromium and manganese and lithium and all these strange minerals. And the Yanks have taken an approach where they say that this is an issue, and they've kind of invoked the Defence Act over there to say this is critical. If we find these here in the United States, you'll get tax breaks, you'll get assistance, you'll get it shoved through the corridors of power in Washington because we need to have it. Are they looking at us and saying we got to help the Aussies get it out?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. And yeah, that long list of minerals. I think gallium got a mention in question time as well. I might have to consult the periodic table for some of these. But I guess it kind of comes back to the kind of broader question again. I think, another one of the consequences of what has been such a stunted conversation on climate change, where we've spent, 2 decades trying to get out of the gate and been talking about whether we should even have a broader emissions target and should even begin to talk about climate change. That on the one side, as we were just talking about, we're kind of a long way from where we need to be on the conversation about the difficult parts of the transition, but I think we're also a long way behind on, kind of harnessing the opportunities in terms of being at the forefront of being a leading renewable industry, using some of the minerals that we have here to kind of lead the world towards the manufacture of solar panels, so many other things. I know that Twiggy Forrest has had a lot to say in the context of the last budget about hydrogen. We're obviously playing catch up with the US and all the money through the Inflation Reduction Act that they've been throwing at their hydrogen industry. And I think it's a question whether Australia is able to play catch up and have a viable hydrogen export industry, and so many other of these questions that I think we're kind of, a little bit behind out of the gate. But I think, they are really interesting questions, and I think it's worth acknowledging that the climate transition has opportunities for us as well.
And it's really an interesting one too, Ian. They keep talking about China, that China does so much of the processing of these minerals, and we really need to do that here rather than sort of, the traditional dig and ship approach that we've taken.
Well, in South Australia, they've just announced a big expansion of the Roxby Downs area because there's a lot of copper there. And in fact, it often is talked about as uranium mine, but there's vast amounts of copper there. That's going to be something that will be used in this transition as well. We often forget about the importance of copper. It made huge wealth for South Australia in the 19th century, and it will make huge wealth again. And that can be processed. And obviously, we as a country need to think about doing more processing here ourselves. And when we were talking before about the green bonds, they could be used for this purpose as well, because you can actually use them because these minerals are part of that transition. So if we do need to have exploration, processing and those sorts of things here, it's all part of the overall interconnectivity of addressing the climate change issue. And I think what Tom just said is perfect. I mean, we spent 20 years stuffing around. It's time to get on with it.
How do you do that in a just way? I mean, you were saying before, Polly, what have we got out of all this gas export? Is there a risk we ask in 50 years' time, what do we get out of all that?
Oh, absolutely. Gas, coal, the majority of our resources industry, we don't actually see the benefits in Australia. And I don't want to come on the show and just argue with everyone. But there is, I think we need to be really cautious about this idea that just because one of our major commodities, i.e. coal, is going to demand is going to wane globally, that's just a fact, that we therefore have to scramble to replace it with some other kind of resource or commodity. You know, yes, that's kind of on brand for Australia, but there is merit in stopping and asking why. You know, why do we need to be a renewable energy superpower? We export a lot of other things: education, ideas, innovation, food. And the reason I say that is because people like to wave around big dollars in terms of GDP. You know, coal is worth bazillion dollars to our GDP, but it brings in very little in terms of tax, royalties and employment. If we are going to choose to export or, you know, dig up, process, refine critical minerals in Australia, we need to make sure we're doing it in a way that actually is just for. There will be a lot of remote communities in Australia who are, well, I already know there's prospectors now looking out there. We need to make sure that the tax regime is fair, that the taxes are in Australia, the profits are in Australia, that the royalties are in Australia, that the employment is in Australia. There's a lot of questions to be asked. I agree with Ian. Why don't we just get on with it? So much of this could be sorted out by regulation, to be honest. But just saying we are going to be a renewable energy superpower and like charging ahead, you're right. In 20 years' time, we might go, well, that was a mistake.